All right. All right, everybody. I'm really excited. We're doing Star Wars The Clone Wars 2008 theatrically released movie.
What?
And
Aw,
and
that's sad.
let me tell you how initially disappointed I was, and I'll tell you why. When the 2003, 2004, and 2005 seasons of Star Wars Clone Wars came out, the Gennady Tartakovsky series, I found that so fascinating, and I loved how they bridged episodes 2 to 3, and building up anticipation for episode 3 in particular was really fantastic. And I had seen zero trailers, none. I didn't see one trailer at all going into the 2008 film, and I thought, oh, all they're doing is just repackaging what they did in those 3 seasons of that series and putting it on the big screen. Well, I was sorely disappointed because not only was it not a repackage, not only was it not that, it wasn't even a repackaging. And even for me, more confusingly, Asajj Ventress had been in the original Star Wars Clone Wars, and she was here. I'll tell you 2 other things that really frustrated me, and then I'm just getting these off my chest for context about the movie, and we can get into good things. One thing that I didn't like was, one of the good things about Star Wars Clone Wars, the original series, was showing how Anakin became a Jedi Knight, and you don't see that in the new series. You just don't. And the other is Asajj Ventress just came out of nowhere. There was no backstory for her. And in the original Star Wars Clone Wars, we do get a little bit of a background how she came into the service of Count Dooku. So at least that was cool in the original Star Wars Clone Wars. And this 2008 movie just didn't supply that. All right. Oh, and welcome, Allison.
Hello.
Hey. Okay.
Hello.
So now that I've got those frustrations of mine from the 2008 Star Wars, the Clone Wars movie off my chest, of course, for people who have seen it, you know it's the introduction of Ahsoka, and as we'll see, how she gets the nickname Snips, which actually does play a part in our sources for this evening's discussion. And it's pretty cool. And of course, it begins, even though the first couple of seasons of Star Wars: The Clone Wars weren't that good, but the latter several seasons were fantastic. Perhaps, arguably, the best Star Wars product ever. But I'm just putting that out there. Okay. So we are ready for the screen share. All right, so here we go. And there's also, if anybody needs a link, it's on the Facebook page for the event and elsewhere. And so we have, so part of the story here is the kidnapping. We have little Jabba the Hutt's son, a little Huttlet, if you will, gets kidnapped by a rival band of pirates. So kidnapping. I don't think kidnapping is something that is frequently discussed in Judaism. It's a problem we see very clearly here in both Exodus and repeated again in Deuteronomy that you should not be doing it. So in Exodus, you hear that someone who kidnaps someone shall be put to death, and basically that gets repeated in Devarim and Deuteronomy. Okay. So that's all. That's very simple, right? Very straightforward. Someone who kidnaps, they get killed. We have in the Mishnah, so this is basically the first couple centuries of the Common Era. These are those who are strangled, and one of these is someone who should be here. One who kidnaps someone, Begonev Nefesh Misro, someone who kidnaps a Jew, which is interesting. Okay. And then there's all this rabbinic conversation. So at which point are you actually obligated, and like that it's like definitively problematic? So Hagonev Nefesh Misrael Eino Chayiv Ad Sheyachni Senu Lirshuso, that you have to actually bring them onto your property. If you only took them out of their property, that's not actually fully stealing a. Well, it's, by the way, I just have to talk about the language here. We talk in English about kidnapping, but in Hebrew here, Hagonev Nefesh is specifically, you're soul stealing, like you're stealing. You're thieving. You're engaged in soul thievery, basically. Okay, so then, interestingly, Rebbe Yehuda disagrees. He argues and he says, you have to not only bring them to your property, but also make use of them in some sort of fashion. and then puts them to service. Okay, so that's an interesting aspect. Curiously, talking about stealing one's son, even though we're talking about stealing someone else's son, that you can have a disagreement. Can you take your own child? Which sounds like a disagreement as far as who gets to take care of their own children. And then, of course, we also have here in the Mishnah one other little text, which is what if you kidnap someone who is part slave and part free person? So they used to, back in the day, in late antiquity, have people who were servants, who were slaves, and you could have some sort of weird quasi-slave status. And so there's this disagreement here between Rebbe Yehuda and the sages, but I don't know. I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole other ball of wax. But more interestingly, we get back into the Babylonian Talmud here in Sanhedrin 86a. We have in front of us two separate Brightot, and Brightot are basically similar time as the Mishnah. So we're talking first couple of centuries of the Common Era, probably more specifically the 2nd century. And we have here in the first of these Brightot, and first of these teachings. So now here it takes from not the Exodus verse we saw earlier. We saw Exodus 21:16, right? One who kidnaps someone is put to death. Now here we are talking about Exodus 20:13. Now Exodus chapter 20 does anybody remember what's going on in Exodus 20? Does anybody know? Yeah, Allison?
Wouldn't that be when Yosef was taken by his brothers and sold?
Oh, that'd be interesting. So here it's actually Lo Tignov. Does that ring a bell? Lo Tignov?
Oh, the 10 Commandments?
Yes.
Yay.
Lo Tignov, 10 Commandments. You got it. So here, this is actually one of the 10 Commandments, Lo Tignov. You should not steal. So the rabbis actually say this isn't just talking about taking an item and stealing. This is a book. So it says Lo Tignov. What do you mean Lo Tignov? Benogev nefashos hakasuv medaber. We're talking about stealing souls here. So really what the sages are saying is this isn't simple stealing, which we can learn elsewhere. Well, we'll see later. This is really talking about stealing people. So in English, it says you should not steal this with regard to one who abducts people in the process. Do you say with regard to one who abducts people, or only with regard to one who steals property? You say, go out and learn from one of the 13 hermeneutical principles, a matter derived from its context. So what's the context? And Allison already pointed out what the context is. It's the 10 Commandments, and these are interpersonal in this section of the 10 Commandments. So what's the context? Is the verse speaking with regard to capital cases? So to here with regard to a capital case, because as we saw earlier, elsewhere in Exodus and also in Deuteronomy, Hagoni Nefashos, one who engages in abducting people, is a capital offense. Okay. And then we're going to see it a separate way. So here, Tanya Idach, we learn elsewhere, it's taught else in a different way. Lo Tignovu. Okay, so in Leviticus 19, now Leviticus 19 is the sort of the middlemost chapter of the book of Leviticus. If this one is, I like to think of Leviticus 19 as like the crux, right? So Leviticus is like the middlest book of the 5 books of Moses, and then this chapter is like the middlemost of the entire book of Leviticus. This is a nice turning point. And by the way, if you look at which chapters are on the sides of 19, it's 18 and 20, and 18 and 20 in Leviticus are the sexual things. So they're basically mirroring each other. So this is like the inflection point for all of the Torah, and it has a lot of really great things. If you want to go home and do some great homework, read Leviticus 19. It's great. It's really kind of like a greatest hits of the Torah. It talks about Shabbat. It talks about Peah, leaving the corner of your field fallow. It talks about lots of things. It talks about honoring your elders. It's like all these really good things. And one of the other things included here is Lo Tignovu. Okay, so you shouldn't steal. So the sages say you shall not steal. So Begonev Mamon Hakasuv. It's talking about monetary matters, or English here says stealing property, the verse is speaking. So do you say with regard to stealing property, or only with regard to abducting people? You say, go out and learn from one of the 13 hermeneutical principles, a matter derived from its context. Regarding what is the subsequent verse, you shall neither exploit your neighbor nor rob him. So that's talking about property. So too here in Leviticus 19:11, are we talking also about property? So this is really fascinating because even though we already have Exodus and Deuteronomy, the earlier verses which talk about the punishment for abducting people, here what the sages are saying, these two verses about not stealing in both Exodus and Leviticus are actually, one is about abducting people and it's the warning not to, right? It's the instruction, don't steal people. What we see elsewhere in Exodus and Deuteronomy is, here's the punishment. And then of course this Leviticus 19 is understood as, by the rabbis, is this one is talking about not stealing property. It's a really fascinating perspective because I think most people, when they see lo tignob, don't steal in the Ten Commandments, they think, oh, this is just don't steal, someone else's wagon or donkey or pencil or whatever it may be. But the rabbis have a broader context and they see these two stealing things, which is which, right? And one in Exodus, one in Leviticus. You're not just going to say don't steal twice. So they say one stealing people, one stealing property. Cool. I know I went at length about that, but I find it really cool. This rabbi, the rabbinic sort of layover on the Ten Commandments is saying, nope, this is kidnapping here. So, all right. So this is something that I probably could have dealt with a little bit in our third session, which was on Return of the Jedi, because Return of the Jedi is the first Star Wars movie in which we see Jabba the Hutt's palace on Tatooine. But guess what? This movie has the second occurrence in a Star Wars cinematic occurrence of Jabba the Hutt's palace. Now, what we see here in front of us is not Jabba the Hutt's palace. I know it's not Jabba the Hutt's palace. We do see Jabba the Hutt's palace later on in the movie, but what Jabba the Hutt's palace shares on, and Tatooine shares with this temple on the planet of Teth, is that both of them were formerly temples inhabited by Ba'omar monks. Okay, Ba'omar monks used to be in both of them, and I think there's some sort of story where the brains of Ba'omar monks are still preserved in some sort of formula in glass with little legs, and I think even during Revenge of the Return of the Jedi that I think some of these Ba'omar monks are still around at the time. With legs. You know what, Daryl? I'll have to find this somewhere. It's a really curious thing. I'll happily share this when I find it. It's in one of these books. Okay, so yeah. So Jabba the Hutt, he's a gangster, right? And he basically, his palace is a former temple. And so too is this, I'm not sure if it's entirely abandoned, a monastery for these Ba'omar monks, but that's what we have here at the beginning of the movie, this Ba'omar monk temple or monastery on the planet of Teth. Now, I'm pointing this out because what's the role of temple in Jewish, in biblical and rabbinic sources? So we have in the book of Exodus, Ba'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. So you shall make me a sanctuary, some sort of sanctification place, and I will dwell within you. So the language of mikdash, which later gets used for the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, which there used to be two of, the Beit HaMikdash. I like to translate as sanctification house because I think that's a pretty good translation, even though most people just translate as Holy Temple, which doesn't really mean a whole lot. But the idea is that this is the primary place of sanctification, of sanctifying, and so I'm going to say two separate things. So we had originally, when the Jews were in the desert, they had a Mishkan, which is basically an apartment. It's a place for God to dwell. And then eventually, later on, when King Solomon built the Beit HaMikdash, he built the temple, that was a more permanent structure beyond just the Mishkan. So then we have in Ezekiel, whatever, we have this whole thing, but eventually it says, so So I have become to them a miniature sanctification, or like a little sanctuary, if you will, in all these other lands where they've gone. Okay. So this verse I just mentioned from Ezekiel, in the prophets, the rabbis talk about, and these are some 4th century rabbis, some like late 3rd, early 4th century rabbis in Megillah 29:8, talking about this verse in Ezekiel 11. Rabbi Yitzchak says, these are the synagogues and study halls in Babylonia. And Rabbi Elazar says, this is the house of our master, okay. And then Rava also, okay. Rava uses a different verse, and he says also the synagogues and study halls. He's already in the 4th century. He's the generation later. But it's really interesting, the idea of taking that notion from Ezekiel, of talking about this Mikdash Ma'at, this like miniature sanctuary, and using that to describe what these Bate Knesiot of Bate Midrashot are, these houses of, basically houses of prayer and also houses of study. There is holy activity taking place in these structures by these people, and they retain some sort of miniature sort of indwelling of God's presence, as it were, and making a biblical connection here. So that's the Jewish perspective on things. I mean, it's obviously not, I have no idea what the Bo'omar monks did or how they operated, but okay. I'm going to take a pause at this time.
Like,
Does that,
can I say something about temples and stuff?
Yes, 100%.
So like, I kind of feel like I would have gone a different direction with this, like the temple becoming Jabba's palace kind of situation. Sure. Like, I feel like it's similar to, and I don't know if this is in text anywhere. It's one of those things I learned in my base Yaakov education that I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but it makes sense that it would be true. That like, you know, when the Romans conquered, you know, during the Second Temple period, right, that they like Herod put like a statue of himself like in the temple and like stuff like that. I feel like that's very similar kind of to like a temple becoming Jabba's palace, like a temple, like, you know, like the Beis Hamikdash becoming like also a place of like depravity. Not that I like think the Romans were necessarily as depraved as those who taught me my base Yaakov education think that they were, but you know, like
defiled.
Like,
they defiled, right?
Right.
Right.
So like that idea of that, I feel like is kind of parallel here of like, you know, taking something that was like so holy and turning it into like Jabba's palace, you know, of all things.
Right, which is full of debauchery and torture and just, you know, tossing your dancers down to the Rancor. Yeah. Very different. Okay, just to, because people are curious, people want to know. Okay, so this is, of course, the Holy Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge in the world. But we have here, I don't know if I can, but we have here this picture, and that's a Bo'omar monk, or at least that's what's left of him. And in here, I think, is his brain, and then he's got these like spider legs so that he can get around on. There are probably other places in the Star Wars universe where these Bo'omar monks kept their monasteries or temples. But as far as in the Star Wars current canon, all we've seen is both Tatooine and Teth. And curiously, both have been in theatrically released movies. And they had, oh, this is cool. They believed in isolating themselves from all physical sensation to enhance the power of their minds. So the enlightened monks had their brains transplanted with nutrient-filled jars, and they used spider-like droid walkers to move around, or four-legged walkers. Yeah. So some really fascinating stuff. They're all drawings. And the order possessed multiple regeneration gems, and they were stored underground behind triple doors. Okay. Yeah. I hope that helps. Certainly, at least for Daryl. Yes, legs. They were there. They were both in Jabba's palace and here in this movie. Fun stuff. The more you know, right? Okay. Now back to our sources. Okay. We have, there's a lot in this movie about the relationship. I want to say relationship. There's a lot in this movie about the responsibility of teachers to take on that task. So there's a lot of convincing of Anakin that he needs to teach. Okay, he needs to pass on his learning, his knowledge. Of course, you know, being on Christophsis in this movie, they were amidst this battle. Somehow Ahsoka comes down, and Obi-Wan says, "Oh, hey, this is the Padawan I've been expecting." So Anakin just says, "Yeah, sure," right? And so we have this little banter. You really think it's a good idea to bring a Padawan learner into all this? I think that's Anakin. I spoke to Master Yoda about it. You should put in a request for one. You'd make a good teacher. Anakin says, "No thanks." And Anakin, teaching is a privilege, and it's part of a Jedi's responsibility to help train the next generation. And Anakin says, "A Padawan would just slow me down." This is before all the rest of the Star Wars The Clone Wars. So I don't have a good text. I mean, there's probably as you'll see in the rest of this, so there's so many other good teaching quotes about the importance of teaching. I'm sure there's a lot in Judaism. We have certainly a bunch of stuff I'm going to share from rabbinic literature, and this is maybe really an entirely separate conversation of how you could bring teaching into this and the responsibility. We do see in Pirkei Avot, I don't know if I have it here, because I think I definitely did the other. I know I mentioned before about the necessity, and certainly we talked about this in the original trilogy, the necessity for a person to aseh lecha rav, that they should make a teacher for themselves, right? As a student, that's the student's responsibility in rabbinic literature, not the master's responsibility, not the teacher, not the rabbi's responsibility. At the same time, what we will see is, so let's go to the acquiring a student. So it's time for a proper introduction. I'm the new Padawan learner. I'm Ahsoka Tano. Very first ever on-screen appearance for Ahsoka Tano. I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi, your new master. I'm at your service, Master Kenobi. But I'm afraid I've actually been assigned to Master Skywalker. No. There must be some mistake. He's the one who wanted a Padawan. Nope, Master Yoda was very specific. I'm assigned to Anakin Skywalker, and he is to supervise my Jedi training. But that doesn't make any sense. And then they have to deal with this later because they're amidst a battle, and they have greater things to deal with. So I do have, look, right at the very top, the very first text, the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, one of the most famous text chunks in rabbinic literature. So the men of the Great Assembly said, one of the things they said is raise many disciples. So there is a notion that certainly in the rabbinic tradition, it's really important to as many disciples as possible. Now, the one thing I could connect here is to raise many disciples, you have to start with one. You have to start somewhere. But not, so that's certainly, when they're saying to Anakin, like certainly Obi-Wan, like, oh, you should do this. As far as, I'm certainly curious as far as, this earlier line about teaching is a privilege from Obi-Wan, and also as part of a Jedi's responsibility to help train the next generation. There's got to be something, like, I don't know how to, maybe it's somewhere in rabbinic literature. It's certainly something that doesn't go against rabbinic ideals. Certainly teaching is important, and certainly a sense of the responsibility therein. Okay. All right, nicknames. So if anybody has ever seen Star Wars: The Clone Wars and the interactions between Anakin and Ahsoka, you know that they have nicknames for each other, right? We have Sky Guy and Snips. So nicknames is an interesting topic. So I think it's one of the clones, it could be Captain Rex. One of the clones asks, who's the youngling? I'm Master Skywalker's Padawan. The name's Ahsoka Tano. Sir, I thought you said you never have a Padawan, so this is a clone to Anakin. There's been a mix-up. The youngling isn't with me. Stop calling me that. You're stuck with me, Sky Guy. So that's what she gives to him. What'd you just call me? Don't get snippy with me, little one. I don't even think you're old enough to be a Padawan. Well, maybe I'm not, but Master Yoda thinks I am. And then, of course, this is the origin for Anakin calling her Snips for the rest of not only the movie, but the TV series. So that's how she gets Snips, because she got snippy with him. And, of course, he doesn't really care for the Sky Guy piece. Okay, so we have a few relevant texts here when it comes to nicknames. We have they're all from the Babylonian Talmud. We have here from Megillah 28a, they asked, the students of Rabbi Zera was asked, how'd you merit such long days? Like, you've lived a long life. So he says, all my life, I never did this. I never did that. I never did this, that, the other thing, etc. And one of the last things was, never did I call my fellow by his derogatory nickname. Okay. And some say by his nickname. Okay. Now, it's not really clear. I mean, it's not really clear what this is, right? Rebbe Zera certainly is saying, this is a good thing that I did. Not necessarily, it's just something that I merited. It's not an obligation, just it's a good thing. I think I did a socially, I mean, you certainly see the other things. Some of them have more of a, like a religious component to them, but some of them are more of a social nature. But here, this is more of a social nature. I didn't call anybody by a derogatory nickname. Maybe it helped him, you know, certainly in his own personal social relations, as well as maybe just his own sense of well-being. Totally differently, this is a really great line in Gittin 52a. It's a Breita, and we have Rabbi Yosei, who's a mid to late 2nd century rabbi. He says, all my life, I never called my wife, nor did I ever call my ox, my ox. I called my wife my house and my ox my field. All right, so he certainly has these like different nicknames, but they're not of a derogatory nature. They're more of a, like, almost, I know this could be taken many different ways. I think it's more of an honorable way of like, she is the rock of my house. If it wasn't for her, like, I wouldn't have anything house-wise, and if it wasn't for my ox, I wouldn't have my field, right? What good's a field without an ox, and what good's a house without a wife? So it's nice little nicknames. I'm sure everybody has their own opinions, and I also suspect there's a difference between the it's clearly androcentric, for sure, and how what sort of gynocentric criticisms could be of this. I'm curious and open to those. And then the final section we have here is Bava Metzia 58b. A repeater taught before Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, anyone who humiliates another in public, it is though he were shedding blood. Okay, we have all these different things, but eventually we have, apparently there's a statement of Rabbi Chanina that says everybody descends to Gehenna except for 3. So, and so what are they? And one of them is one who calls another a derogatory nickname. So in Hebrew, it's the Vahamachana Shem Ra Lechavero, one who affixes a bad name on their friend, a bad one. So, and then of course, this makes some sort of whitening of face. Okay. It's because people clearly have nicknames for people. That's human life. That's how we interact. We always have, I'm not saying it's de rigueur, but nicknames happen in life. We refer to people in some sort of shorthand. Maybe there's some sort of humor attached, some tongue-in-cheek aspect. So I think the Rabbi Yossi piece is saying, look, I'm in a sort of there is some certain honorability that Rabbi Yossi is according both his wife and ox. As far as this understanding of Rabbi Chanina piece, affixing a bad name to your friend, that's not good. And maybe even this statement of Rabbi Zera of even, it's not clear whether it's a derogatory nickname or even a non-derogatory nickname, which is even grayer still. But certainly there's a challenge. It's not so clear. Like, it's not like, oh yeah, whatever nickname you want to give. I think the rabbis are trying to say here with social relations, we give nicknames happen, but when you go down a dark path, and certainly an unfriendly path, that's something to stay away from. Good nicknames, fun nicknames, those are good. All right, thoughts on the nickname piece?
Well, it's interesting, I think, because in Star Wars, it's like taking on a name that's not your own is kind of a dark side thing, right? Like Anakin becomes Darth Vader, and Palpatine is Darth Sidious, right? Like they have these like Darth names, right? That are like they're dark side names. So it's almost like, right, like the dark side is like embracing taking on a name that's not your own, which is like interplays interestingly with this, I think.
Yeah. Huh. Now I'm trying to think of like how change can also change your luck, right? There's obviously there's this phrase, Shinoi makom, Shinoi mazal. Once you change your place, you change your luck, if you want to translate mazal and luck. Yeah, I need to look more into that, because I'm also thinking about when it comes to changing names, of that sometimes people would throw on the name Chaim on someone if they're encountering something of a life-threatening nature, and hoping that will change their lives, literally. So, yeah, could be. I like that. The Darth piece. Now I'm trying to think of elsewhere in Star Wars, are there name changes, like conscious name changes, aside from anybody going as a Darth? There is we do see that Kanan Jarrus was originally Caleb Doom, and he changes his name to save his life, because if he kept his Jedi name, he would be, he was still being hunted anyways, but at least it allowed him greater safety of passage and getting places with a different name.
And Han Solo in the Solo movie too, he gets the name Solo added onto his name when he's getting off of his original planet.
Yeah, there's another name addition, yeah.
One thing that I think might be kind of interesting too is that, what is derogatory or not? Except of course with the One Piece, it doesn't matter even if it is derogatory. But maybe in that first meeting we could say, okay, it still is like a derogatory nickname between the two of them. But it just kind of brought up this idea of, what about when the meaning of things change? Like when you maybe have a rival who you then later become you come to respect them, and so things become friendly, and what used to be something you did with a bad intent on that dark way becomes something that's nice. Or maybe even vice versa. Maybe there's something that's kind of a nickname, but then as maybe your circle of friends come to not like this other person, maybe you start using that nickname in a bad way or something. And so what about when the meanings changed, or essentially when what's in your heart changes when you use it? Maybe it's not about the name as much about that intent, and maybe that falls into either. But I don't know if any of the text actually speaks to a change in meaning. That's just something I thought of.
That is good. I wouldn't be surprised if post-Talmudic commentators talk about, especially that one text where is it just a derogatory nickname or just any nickname? And they probably have some interesting conversation trying to suss that out. That's good. But as far, it's good. All right. Any other nickname comments, questions, queries?
I just thought an obvious one was the clones. Pretty much all the clones have nicknames. Not all of them, the ones that we see later in the show, are all nicknames. Yeah. So I thought that was kind of interesting along with this one. Right.
That they're not just cogs in a machine, that they have individual personalities.
Yeah.
Whether it's 555, fives instead of just CT, whatever 555, and all of them.
Yeah.
Of course, you get Captain Rex.
Very good point.
Right, and also it's actually interesting. Now we could talk about actually, you know what, Jason, you bring up something interesting, because we can go the exact opposite direction, right? Where you have a given name, but you go by a nickname, and we see this with Krell, Pong Krell, right? He's the Jedi that turns during the Clone Wars series. He starts to turn to the Separatist side. And so instead of calling the clones by the names that they choose to go by with their nicknames, he actually calls them by their sort of factory production line names, which they really don't like. And ultimately it does, and Daryl, this is going to go back to your point, ultimately it does have to do with intent, right? Because he really doesn't care for them, and they're just dispensable things that he really doesn't care about, versus on the other hand, Jedi who are actually committed to the cause, and certainly Anakin, who cares about the individuals, and Yoda, they care about the individual clones. So there's something to be said about actually using the names that someone wants to be called by, even when it's just a nickname and not their official name.
Oh, definitely. Most probably don't hear, but I was in the military for a while, and you have to call officers by their rank. But we had a major who was pretty funny because he said he could, and he really kind of could. He could tell when you were saying, yes, sir, major, or yes, major, in like a positive way, or when you were saying it because you had to say it, but in your mind you were thinking something very else. And he's like, yeah, I know what you mean by that. And like, he could catch it. He could catch the meaning. So like that kind of fits in with that of like, yeah, like times when you are intentionally emphasizing the formal or the specific name to actually be derogatory. Yeah.
That's good. It's good. The intention, the inflection of it. Yeah.
And then based on kind of what Jason brought up about that too, that made me actually think of Finn, who is born, probably maybe had a name his parents were going to bestow on him that he loses and never knows, is given a designation, and then rejects that designation and is given the Finn name by Poe. So there is an example of another name change. Yeah. But that one's like got an even extra level to it.
Right. Right. And it's a similar one as with the clone troopers. Here he's a first order stormtrooper, but he was like stolen as a baby. Right. Cool. All right. Ready to move on? All right, we got some more teaching stuff. As we can see, we got teachers and students. We have, come on, master, let's go. If we survive this, Snips, you and I are going to have a talk. And then we hear from a clone trooper. They make quite a pair, don't they, sir? You think they have a chance? But they better. And I really want to do, I think someone else can do something if they decide to teach this on how maybe the relationship between a teacher and a student, right? And having, how does, hold on just a second. Still with me?
Yes, we're still here.
Yeah. All right, I'm a little bit worried about now. All right, I'm going to totally change the settings. All right, we're back. Different background. Okay, so I really would like to do something here. The pairing, you know, of I think there's sometimes we see something about especially when some of the students traveled from the land of Babylonia to Israel, that they had negative there were more challenging relationships. So I think there's something to be said about the relationship between teachers and students. Readiness for teaching. So we have, I was explaining the situation to Master Yoda. Really? Well, if not ready for a Padawan you are, then maybe Obi-Wan we can, no. Wait a minute, I admit, so Anakin changes his tune. I admit it, Ahsoka's a little rough around the edges, but with a great deal of training and patience, she might amount to something. And go with you, she will, to the test system. So I think this is a really fascinating one because it has this sense of, I want to say not just like patience, but also an idea of, you know, a willingness to teach or train or something along those lines. This is, again, another one where there's like a whole chunk about teaching that could be relevant for this movie. Similar teaching one. Let's just hope Anakin is ready for this responsibility. Ready he is to teach an apprentice. To let go of his pupil, a greater challenge will be master this Skywalker must. So again, we have something about teaching to be able to let go of student. You can't just always hold on. Sometimes students have to go and off and be in the world. And maybe, you know, in the rabbinic system, it could also be going out to a different town or a village and serving as the teacher there, as serving as the Rav of the city, as the Mara d'Asra. So there is something to be said for that. If someone has a good text, it'd be great. Okay, nothing happens by accident. Ahsoka, a very wise Jedi, once said, nothing happens by accident. It is the will of the Force that you are at my side. So one text I had for this is from Pirkei Avot, which Rabbi Akiva used to say, Hakol Tzafoi, that everything is foreseen, Barashut Nisuna. Yet freedom of choice is granted. So now we have, that's one little text. It's funny when we start talking about these notions of either hashgacha pratit, of individual divine providence, or hashgacha klalit, of sort of more broader general divine providence. But these are medieval philosophical conversations. They're not so much in like biblical and rabbinic texts. So certainly someone could use this text if they were teaching like a Star Wars and Judaism discussion. They could talk whether it's from the more hashgacha pratit philosophers or the hashgacha klalit people like this Rabag, Gersonides. He's definitely a hashgacha klalit. Okay. All right, just a few more. Any questions so far? All right, healing. So what seems to be the problem? Great, I've got a sick hutlet. You got a remedy? Oh yes, I see. You must dispense one of these medical boosters into the infant's mouth. If you have any problems, please call an actual doctor to assist you. I hope this works. So the idea of healing, it could be that someone feels that healing is like interceding in nature against God's will. But the rabbis were very quick to point out there's a text, a verse in the book of Exodus of Rapo Yirape. Now this comes it has a very particular context, but the rabbis took it more broadly in saying it's not just that this person shall surely be healed, but Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael is taught at Rabbi Yishmael's academy. So here, Mikan Shnitna Reshut Lerofe Lerapot. So here, this verse in Exodus is where the permission for doctors to do their work, to heal, or really, if we want to go more broadly, for people to heal, for people to be engaged in healing other people, which, as we see from this scene here in the Clone Wars, that even just Ahsoka dispensing one of the medical boosters into the little Hutlet's mouth is something that's a good thing. Finally, sins. So Master Yoda has a saying, old sins cast long shadows. Do you know what he means by that? He means your past can ruin your future if you allow it. So it's really fascinating. Obviously, in biblical and rabbinic texts, sin is all over, it abounds. At the same time, we do have a notion that you can do teshuvah. And also, yes, we tend to have a lot of guilt, that's true. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that sin is somehow this like overriding concern at all times that like shackles us to whatever, but sin is a big part of biblical and rabbinic texts. And it's interesting because there is this Deuteronomy 5:9, which I've included here, of that God is he is an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third, and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me. That there's the notion that you could really have a long tail of God remembering these things and it affecting, like even after someone dies, generations later. And yet the idea, the notion of teshuvah, of not only personal repentance, but even on a national level, that's what Yom Kippur is all about, that we have an annual national cleansing of sins is something that is a big part. Of course, people may carry around sins or whatever weight on their shoulders, but still the idea that there's some sort of cleansing mechanism, some sort of fresh start ability is helpful. So thoughts, questions, comments, queries?
I had one kind of thing. Just to make that a little less depressing, isn't there like an
Yes.
opposite thing to it where it's like the kindness that you do goes for like 40 generations or something? There's kind of like an opposite end to it. Or it was like the kindness in the mitzvahs last longer than the sins or whatever.
Oh, nice.
I don't know if you would know that or not, but I feel like I've heard that somewhere.
I haven't, but I'm really curious to hear more about it. I'll look into that. I'll see what's going on with that. That's it. That's really curious. It's cool. Anybody else? This is definitely a shorter one because I think there's a lot less in this. I could be wrong. Feel free to debate me and disagree. I think there's a lot less in this theatrically released movie than in other theatrically released Star Wars movies. I mean, it's also interesting because, it's funny because now looking forward to the next 5 sessions, this is the last movie before the acquisition by Disney. And so Disney has their stuff, but obviously The Force Awakens is going to be a lot of very similar stuff as A New Hope, I suspect. And then, so we'll see. I don't know. I don't remember. We'll see. It should be an interesting final 5 of, the Disney-made Star Wars films. But this was definitely a nice little ride. Daryl, you have something?
Okay, like I was saying at the beginning, I think Rogue One's going to be one of the most interesting discussions for those, especially looking forward to, well, not even the implication, but also right there in front of the beginning with Cassian basically doing very unscrupulous things like murder in service of the cause, and then how that weighs on him, but how that also makes them be like, we can't have this be for nothing. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be justification for that in any text, but I am still looking. I'm looking forward to that discussion and seeing all that in there. So I think it'll have some interesting things to look at in those ones. For today, I found the teaching stuff to be the most interesting, especially kind of, thinking of the idea of that, like, on the one hand, the student has to find the teacher in kind of a way of like, you can't just teach somebody. They have to be invested in learning. They have to be willing to come and get the knowledge, because they're not going to receive it if you just throw it at them and they don't really care, don't want it. It just kind of goes through them, which I think that's something that is missing a lot from university culture right now. A lot of it is just, we'll just jump through the hoops and get the job at the end. I'm not here to learn. I'm here to get the certificate for the job, as opposed to, I want to go find someone to actually impart information to me and receive it. So I like that today. That was kind of one of my favorite parts of the day.
Oh,
and it
cool.
was, because it wove throughout too.
Yeah, I feel bad that I didn't have more relevant teaching ones. There is a lot of teaching stuff in certainly rabbinic literature, and one I didn't do, it's funny you mentioned that, is like one who, I'm just saying this off the top of my head, but one who learns to do versus like one who learns to just teach. It's a very different set of like what you're trying to do. Here, let me pull that one up. One who learns to teach.
That would be neat.
Yeah. So okay, so it's in the 4th chapter. Oh, here we go. Rabbi Shmuel, son of Baruch, said, "One who learns in order to teach will be enabled both to learn and to teach. But he who learns in order to practice will be able to learn, to teach, to observe, and to practice." So I think that the difference is really there in that text in Pirkei Avot in the 4th chapter is really about the difference of just teaching versus teaching, but also like the practical aspects as well. Right? Is that a fair? As we're going to teach. It's funny because it's like if you just want to teach, it's just material to share versus material to share, but also to do in a practice. It's something of a more practical order. Is that a helpful text, Daryl?
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Okay.
I think it's interesting and also kind of useful because, some of my colleagues don't, they went basically straight from undergrad into grad school, as opposed to someone who's done a little more life experience. So I can be like, hey, I'm doing and I'm teaching.
Yeah.
So a little partial on there, but no, I know it's very interesting.
That's great. That's great. Awesome, everybody. Any thoughts, comments, questions, queries before we wrap up for the evening?
I was just thinking also the teaching part, because that's like how I make my parnassas. I'm an English teacher, so that was interesting for me to read too, especially letting go of your students. And this year I didn't really have a chance to like formally let my students go, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. There is something to be said about being able to let go of students. I don't know what good text there is off the top of my head for rabbinic literature, but there has to be something. I mean, especially I imagine they might have had some competition to some degree, like the teachers with other teachers for where students could go. So yeah. Okay. All right. Is that it for the evening, everybody? All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. And I'm excited for The Force Awakens next week. And as always, may the Force be with you.
You too.
Thanks.
All right.
I'm gonna go
Bye,
watch
everybody.
the Clone Wars now. It's the one that I've missed.
Oh, there you go. Awesome. All right. May the Force be with you.
Bye.